I mean, one of the things that I have always loved about De Bethune is, it's a little bit of a problem in terms of having a kind of consistent awareness of the identity of the company, of the philosophy of the company, but nonetheless, the fact that they have experimented as much as they have, and the fact that they have tried so many different things and stuck with the things that they have innovated with, I think is really, really impressive. The period, probably 2005 especially, right through the end of the financial crisis, there was so much experimentation just across the board in fine watchmaking, especially with new ways to implement high complications, new technical solutions. We saw Cartier launch its fine watchmaking collection. And I love that stuff. It was fun to write about. It was obviously not, in retrospect, it wasn't exactly what the larger Cartier audience wanted from Cartier, but it was really, really impressive stuff. But when a company does something like that, what you really hope is that they're going to stick to their guns. They're going to demonstrate faith in their own philosophy and their own products.
Yes.
And I always got the impression with De Bethune that they had a 110% commitment to the path that they had chosen, and that they would rather not make watches at all than make watches that didn't represent to them a further expression of this highly idiosyncratic expression of watchmaking. And I think one of the places that you find the most characteristic expression of that philosophy is in the Dream watches.
Yeah, the Dream watches are exceptional, and we got to hit the rewind button for a moment, but when they first started coming out, even their style was idiosyncratic. Dream Watch 1, I don't know how you describe it, a pendant watch, a pocket watch, a little bit of Egyptian revival, all of that, and they give you the ability in your own watch to change the timing of the watch.
Right.
Then we get tourbillon regulators. We get the perpetual calendar tourbillon Dream Watch 2, the tourbillon Dream Watch 3, which is like the one with a tourbillon. We get the insane Dream Watch 4 with its iPhone associations. Again, they're not afraid of being iconoclastic and rocking the boat.
Yeah.
And then the Dream Watch 5.
It's yeah. The iPhone cases. It's antiquated technically, but I still think it looks really cool.
It's still cool. It'll be an objet d'art long after the iPhone is gone, which is a great thing. There is an enduring beauty, even if it is very much of a time. And with the Dream Watch 5, again, not afraid to blow it up. It doesn't look like any previous De Bethune or any previous Dream Watch. It's somewhere between a spaceship and a seashell. That's all I can say.
Yeah. It's funny, the recent film that shows Denis Flageollet working at his forge and making this really, really beautiful kind of combination spaceship, time machine for the wrist, organic form out of raw iron. There's something really raw and primitive about the whole process. And what you end up with is something that looks like something out of a science fiction movie. The kind of obsession with the realm of the celestial, to put it in a really corny way, that you see at De Bethune, as expressed in the spherical moon phase, as expressed in the Starry Various watches, as expressed less illustratively, but no less strongly in the use of this beautiful, beautiful sort of like, cerulean midnight blue coloration in so many of their watches. It's one of the most attractive things about the De Bethune design language. It gives you a sense that they're part of a larger universe. But while there are kind of, I think, visual steampunk associations and science fiction associations with De Bethune, even in their most extreme expression, I personally never felt as if they were leaning into it too hard, or that they were being too illustrative and non-functional in how those elements were introduced.
It didn't feel like weird for weird's sake, like some brands, or self-consciously different, like, say, an HYT or something like that.
Right.
What was interesting is, having won the GPHG Aiguille d'Or with the DB28 in 2011, the brand really entered its stride in 2010s, and a big reason for that was vertical integration. We've talked about a lot of the proprietary appearances. These are all original designs, but they were making their own cases, they were making their own dials, they were making their own movements, dozens of references. They were doing their own gem setting, engraving. Michel Rotin does all of their engraving. And they were bluing their own titanium, not just using blue titanium, but creating the process. So there's a lot of proprietary process and fabrication and control of the means of production, even at the craft art level, whereas a lot of smaller brands that are making hundreds, not thousands of watches a year, will farm out these individual disciplines.
Yeah, in terms of their approach to horology, they were kind of compelled almost to start, making everything in-house. The De Bethune balance spring, for instance, there's no volume market for something like that. There's no volume market for a balance that is a disc of pure clear silicon with a precious metal rim. These are all things that if you're making them for yourself, and you really can't create a market for them per se as components, just because they're so distinctive and so strongly identified and identifiable with your watchmaking that nobody else would even want to use them, even if they were technically superior. But I think that de Bethune had to go that route in order to continue to grow.
And without a doubt, I think controlling the means of production, when you would tell a contractor, well, I want 12, or I want 13, or I want 20 of these pieces, you do have to set up for low volume, because no mass supplier, the Nivaroxes of the world, they're not going to make these things. De Bethune gets the hairspring material, but then they shape it themselves. They break it into two pieces. They create their proprietary curve, and they clamp it together. And that's just to make the hairspring.
Yeah, and I mean, if you are relying on suppliers to make stuff like that, God knows when you're going to get it, because like you want 10 of them, and you're talking to a company like Nivarox Far that makes I don't know how many millions of balance springs a year, but if you want 10 of this extremely idiosyncratic expression of what a modern balance spring looks like, you're going to have an awfully long wait if you try to order it from a company like that. So just in terms of being able to deliver product in anything like a reasonable time frame, you kind of have to start taking as much control of the means of production as you possibly can.
Yeah, and then as we enter the mid-2010s, we sort of see the brand at its zenith from 2011 to early 2015. This is when, in terms of volume, it made the most watches it had ever made. So between 400 and 450 at peak, they were doing about 30% full custom, which opens up another chapter of the brand that's not well advertised. Pierre Jacques, the CEO now, had his first turn as CEO from 2011 to 2015. And a lot of folks don't realize that the watch industry had a sort of an internal recession from 2015 to 2017. And during that period, there was just a step back for de Bethune from those high volumes, maybe a little bit of overreaching. It was necessary to regroup. Pierre Jacques comes back in 2017, and that sort of marks, I guess, for such a young brand, the modern era. We would call it the modern era, the current regime. David Zanetta retires in 2017, new investors come in, and this is still before the Watchbox era, but there's a refocusing on the core collection that's now the DB25, the DB28, and the entry-level DB27, which is sort of like a middle ground between the conventional 25 and the avant-garde of the 28.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say there's been a narrowing of focus, but there's been a sort of clarification, I think, of the character of the brand in its current collection for sure. And there are plenty of points of connection between the innovations of the past in the present collection. I mean, it's possible now, I think more than ever in the entire history of the brand, to pick up a watch from de Bethune and feel a sense of connection to the history of the brand. And you can talk about the history of the brand in a meaningful way because it has been around since 2002. And I mean, we're 20 years down the road, and it's been an incredible adventure for de Bethune, not without its hiccups, not without its crises, but they have stayed the course. And the fact that you can pick up pretty much any watch in the de Bethune current collection and feel a sense of connection to specific points in the company's history and to specific preceding models, I think is a tremendous strength. I've always been kind of I don't know how to put it, kind of bemused by some of the engraving pieces, though. The Mayan calendar, for example, it doesn't not seem like a de Bethune watch, but it's very much kind of its own thing, I think.
It's the kind of thing that other brands would make for charity auction, but only once for charity auction. Whereas at de Bethune, I believe they've had two separate Mayan editions.
Yes.
So they had the Mayan, which was spectacular, a combination of architecture and Mayan numerals. They did a second edition after that was maybe a little bit more discreet, didn't feature the architectural elements. But then there have also been other wonderful engravings, like the DB25 Deadbeat Second Tourbillon Zodiac. And this is really gilding the lily, because it's all of those things at once.
Yeah, that was there are a surprisingly large number of watches like that in de Bethune's history. They're wonderful expressions of the company's design philosophy. They're wonderful works of art in their own right. And, any one of them would have been the talking piece of the year for pretty much any other brand, and de Bethune being de Bethune, it was, any one of those pieces was one of about 5 talking pieces for any given year. But they're a wonderful extension of the company's qualitative approach, I think, outside the domain of what's customary for de Bethune. And I mean, to a certain extent, they exist for me, kind of in their own category, but they do feel connected to the overall approach to watchmaking at de Bethune as well, and the overall approach to design, which has always been, let's try stuff, let's make it as high quality in terms of craft execution as we possibly can. Let's not shy away from doing something different just because it represents a departure from business as usual. I mean, to the extent that there is such a thing as business as usual at de Bethune. But I mean, the Mayan engraving pieces they're just wonderful to look at. I mean, I never look at them without wanting to look at them longer and without thinking to myself, whatever you might think about how well this is, whether or not this is on brand for de Bethune, it almost kind of doesn't matter whether it's on brand for de Bethune because they're so extraordinary, in their own right.
And the funny thing is, there's sort of like a push-pull. David Zanetta was always a wildly creative fellow, extremely artistic, design first. Denis has always been engineering, science, watchmaking, and then Pierre Jacques, who is kind of now the third man in that history of the company. He's the hard-headed businessman. It's always funny when you look at Denis creating Resonique in 2012, and it's a super high-frequency oscillator that's designed to make mechanical as accurate as quartz. And what did he do? Well, he created it, he open-sourced it, and he let anyone use it if they want. If they could develop it, more power to them.
Right.
And what was the commercial application? Well, there isn't one. Well, why'd you do it? Because it's cool. When we met him, that's exactly what he said.
Yeah, it's funny. The Resonique is it's one of several experiments in creating very, very high frequency mechanical oscillators. They're nominally mechanical. They're mechanically driven. I think one thing that people often forget is that a quartz oscillator actually is a mechanical oscillator. It's driven by electrical current. Yeah, it's tiny.
Yeah.
But it is actually a piezoelectrically driven. It's a mechanical oscillator driven by an electrical current, and its oscillations are counted by an electrical circuit. But the oscillator itself is a mechanical oscillator, and the high frequency experiments that took place at one point relatively recently in the history of modern watchmaking, like the Resonique, I think that they're really fascinating. They've proven very, very difficult to commercialize because there are fabrication issues. There are issues with variations in rate due to temperature. They're pretty sensitive to temperature changes. And the truth is, it's really hard to improve on a lever escapement. The lever escapement has been around since the late 1700s. You can produce watches that are accurate to within a couple of seconds a day at scale, as Rolex does, using a lever escapement. And so the question is, if we're going to do something like this, what else does it bring to the table? The Resonique, for example, is fascinating intellectually, but that's very inside baseball. Because to do something with that commercially, like, who's the audience, right? You're probably the audience, I'm probably the audience, but neither of us could actually.
We can't take up his work and continue.
Well,
it.
and we can't. Yeah, and we couldn't single-handedly support it as a commercial undertaking, even if we wanted to. So look. First, you have to know that there's such a thing as a mechanical watch. Then you have to know that there's such a thing as an escapement. Then you have to know that there's such a thing as a lever escapement, and you have to have a rough idea what some other kinds of escapements are. And then you have to have an idea of what the pros and cons of those escapements are. And then you have to have a sense of what a high-frequency alternative to a conventional escapement, any conventional escapement like the Resonique would be. And at that point, you're down to about 5 guys.
But here's the interesting thing. To talk about the manufacturer today, I think, and we've been there. We've seen the 3 floors of manufacturing of every part of the watch. You have to start with Denis, who's such an interesting guy because he is a scientist and he is a watchmaker, but then he's also a blacksmith. He's got giant hands. They're covered in calluses. He built a forge behind his house, which is right down the street from the factory. He's in there burning bronze and titanium and iron and smelting steels. And this is a guy who's a very nuts and bolts, blacksmith-style basic craftsman before he's anything else. And he's the heart and soul. He's where the manufacturer starts.
I didn't have a chance to meet him until we actually went to visit the de Bethune manufacturer earlier this year. And I wish that I had met him earlier because I've been following his work for 2 decades. And I remember shaking his hand, and he had one of the strongest grips I've ever felt in a handshake in my life. He has forearms that are bigger around than my thighs. And he has this really, really deep connection to the basic fabric of the material that he works with. You watch the film and you see him, take a raw lump of iron from the ground, and hammer it and hammer it and hammer it and gradually turn it into a case. And he talks about needing to have a sense of the grain of the material that you work with, and how different materials respond to being worked, how different metals respond to being worked. Worked with a hammer, worked in a forge, and that connection with the basic structure of the material world, that connection with the basic structure of the natural world, I think it gets into the watches. I think it gets into the watchmaking, and you can feel it when you pick up a de Bethune watch. They don't look or feel, despite the fact that you could not make a de Bethune watch without a lot of modern manufacturing processes, they don't feel, in a certain sense, they feel like modern watches in a certain sense, but they feel like very, very primordial expressions of the human connection to the passage of time in the universe at large on the other.
I think that's a good way to put it. And I think it's interesting to see how a lot of that pervades the manufacturers, because as you go through, you see reflections of Denis everywhere. You see the guy whose only job is to sit there with a bed of brass or copper, firing the one side of the steel spherical moon phase that turns blue. You see the little kiln that they've built where they take, for example, the titanium balls that go into their Mark Newson hourglass collaboration, and they literally cook them, and they have the rejects and they have the successes, and the rejects are brown violet and the successes are cobalt blue. You walk through and you see polishing of titanium. You see stamping of meteorite dials from a solid meteorite blank they bought from Sweden. And there's material manipulation everywhere on those 3 floors.
And one of the biggest revelations for me in actually visiting de Bethune as a manufacturer is the number of manual processes that are going on there. I know that there are modern manufacturing processes involved in producing a de Bethune watch as well. But there are so many, manual case polishing, manual assembling. The heat bluing of the spherical moon phase was a wonderful thing to watch. That particular process is one that never loses its fascination for me, because it's one of those things that you think to yourself, oh, sure, I could probably do that if I had sufficient training. And then you watch someone actually do it, and they make it look easy, but you also realize just how much goes into being able to do it consistently, from one piece to the next. And when we were there, we saw this guy heat bluing a spherical moon phase over the flame of an alcohol lamp that looked like it had been, knocked out by somebody in the village in like 1855 or something.
It probably was.
Yeah.
That's the other thing, though. Although the watches are avant-garde, the production is very traditional. They'll take you through the places where they're laying down stripes, or they're creating cases, or they're milling metals, and they'll say, this machine is no longer made, that machine is no longer made. This is from, 1845, and if we didn't have this one, we wouldn't know where to get another.
Right. Or, as an extension of that, there are certain things that de Bethune does in terms of case crafting and movement assembly for which there are no tools, and they just have to make their own, which is not that unusual in watchmaking. The first thing that you should learn to do if you're a watchmaker is how to sharpen a screwdriver properly. But it's still amazing to see the extent to which handmade is so much a part of what de Bethune does, especially because the watches on a certain level have, they do have this kind of science fiction, outer space, otherworldly quality. But behind that is a lot of very, very traditional craft processes that would be recognizable to and understandable by a watchmaker from 100 years ago.
And what always impresses me is how little space you need to have cases, dials, guilloche dials, engraving, gem setting, movements. All of this is basically on 3 floors of an old farmhouse. They've got their own research and development center, which is, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. Just how dense this craft is, because it derives from something that farmers did in a side room of their home during the cold months of the 19th and 18th century.
Yeah, what you always want to do, what I always want to do as a watch writer when I see something like that is I wish that I could kind of collectively pick up the entire watch enthusiast community by the scruff of their collective neck and carry them to this little town in Switzerland and stick them inside that factory for a day, because it really is hard to convey the impact of seeing just how impressive the combination of all of these high-tech and manual processes really is. And, and as you say, it's not a big factory.
No, and what's incredible is when we talk about these...
factory is kind of a misnomer.
It's almost like a workshop. That's how I described it. It's a workshop. But you talk about these little farmhouses and how local craftsmen used to be part of the watch industry during the cold months when they weren't farming. But you go outside in the back of de Bethune, you look around, you're like, okay, this is very concrete. There are the farms. Those are the farmhouses. This is incredibly bucolic, and de Bethune has grown out of the literal heartland of French-Swiss watchmaking, and it's still very much immersed in that. My phone switched over to a French data plan when we were visiting them because they're so close to the border.
Yeah. It's funny how often really interesting watchmaking seems to take place in relatively geographically isolated areas and mountainous areas. You drive to Glashütte, for instance. Dresden is already kind of a small town in comparison to certainly other larger metropolises in Germany and elsewhere. And then you drive out to Glashütte, and you cover these winding roads and rolling hills. The first time that I went there was in the wintertime, and we weren't sure we were going to be able to get back because the snow started falling so hard. And the de Bethune workshop, let's call it a workshop, the de Bethune workshop is pretty isolated. You have to, it's not that long a drive from Geneva, but you go through some really, really beautiful countryside. You go over the Swiss Jura, the Jura Massif, and you see the same mountains that the folks who lived there 400 years ago would have seen, the same forests, probably some of the same animals. And
or descendants of those animals, certainly.
And the fact that the watchmaking, this very, very high precision and also very craft-driven watchmaking takes place in that kind of environment is a big part of the charm.
And I think it's fun because you take all of these things, the countryside, the mountains, the traditional craft arts, Denis himself, you add it all up and you get what I've always regarded as a brand that makes nothing but Grail watches.
Yeah, absolutely.